Sean Diddy Combs isn't just fighting for his freedom, he's fighting to hold on to his fortune. Forbes now estimates his net worth is $400 million, a significant drop from the $740 million valuation just a few years ago. But that number could shrink even more. Federal prosecutors are moving to seize assets tied to the alleged criminal activity.
It doesn't collapse in public first. It collapses in silence. Behind closed doors, behind confident statements, behind routines that once ran on autopilot.
Once considered a billionaire with a vodka line, a TV network, and a clothing brand, Sean Combs' fortune has taken a major hit. Forbes estimates his net worth is roughly $400 million, nearly half of what it was just a few years ago. Both his Beverly Hills and Miami mansions were raided in March of 2024 as part of the investigation into his alleged crimes. And that number may continue to drop as Combs faces a federal trial and a Justice Department forfeiture action that could cost him his empire. An empire that prosecutors allege was built, at least in part, through a pattern of criminal activity, including alleged sex trafficking, drug distribution, and violence, all used to advance what they call a racketeering enterprise. In the unsealed indictment, prosecutors outline how his business and personal assets allegedly played a role in carrying out or concealing the crimes. This means any assets connected to the behavior, even indirectly, could be seized, including real estate, companies, vehicles, and aircrafts. Now, his $60 million private jet has reportedly already been sold. The Beverly Hills estate is currently on the market for $61 million. And while Combs still owns his $48 million Miami mansion, a judge denied his request to use it as collateral for bond. In week 2 of testimony, Homeland Security Special Agent Gannon took the stand. Gannon, who helped lead the March raids of Combs' homes, walked jurors through photos of the items seized. Among them, parts of AR-15 style rifles with the serial number scratched off, loaded magazines, a Gucci bag reportedly filled with ketamine and MDMA, and personal items like lingerie and dozens of bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Prosecutors say this evidence is critical to establishing the elements required under federal racketeering laws, helping them show a pattern of alleged crime, criminal behavior used to sustain or conceal the enterprise. In an effort to protect what's left of his assets, Combs hired Stefan Casella, former deputy chief of the Justice Department's asset forfeiture and money laundering section, to fight the forfeiture action. If the jury finds Combs guilty, it will be up to them to determine how much of Combs' assets are subject to forfeiture. Anything forfeited after a conviction could be used to support alleged victims. Sean Combs denies all allegations. And to help us break down what's at stake, I'm joined by Jim Trusty. He's the former chief of the Department of Justice, Organized Crime and Gang Section. Jim, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure. Good to be here.
So, Jim, let's start with the forfeiture. This isn't just about prison time anymore. Prosecutors want his empire. From what you've seen in the filings, how aggressive is this?
Well, it looks to be very aggressive, and there's a couple of reasons I say that. The first is it's very broadly worded. What they're talking about is essentially any property, real or personal, that could constitute either facilitating property or instrumentalities, they call it, or proceeds. And so that's kind of the whole business empire of P. Diddy being at risk. And that's the second part, which is it's a RICO case, a criminal enterprise case, where they've defined the organization, the criminal enterprise, as not just Sean Combs, but as all these business interests that he has, including liquor labels, music labels, everything else you can think of. So they've set it up in a way where when they get to a forfeiture phase, if there's a conviction, the sky's the limit, and it looks like they're going to try to take a piece out of him everywhere.
The numbers stop moving, not slowing, not dipping, stopping. The kind of stop that doesn't come with warnings or explanations. One day the system breathes, the next day it doesn't. Revenue hitting zero isn't dramatic in the moment. It's clinical, cold, a line on a report that looks almost wrong because the human brain expects something to be there, even a mistake, even a delay, but zero doesn't blink. For years, the machine ran itself. Income streams layered on top of each other. Music, brands, licensing, appearances, equity plays. Money coming in from so many directions that tracking it felt optional. When cash flows constantly, Discipline feels unnecessary. When success lasts long enough, caution feels insulting. That's how the foundation weakens. Expenses never shrink on their own. Security still needs paying. Properties still demand upkeep. Legal teams don't work on hope. Staff expects salaries. Insurance, logistics, lifestyle, none of it pauses just because the money stopped. When income disappears, spending doesn't politely follow.
And so a lot of times you'll see listings in there of bank accounts, automobiles, jets, whatever, that the government has already preliminarily seized to make sure it's still going to be available at the time they do a forfeiture hearing. So this one, it's a blank slate. And it's blank enough where if you're the defense attorney and you get to this next phase, which, by the way, is supposed to be with the same jury. They may not know that yet. But that second phase would be one where you really would say to the judge, I don't have any notice here, Your Honor. This is so broadly worded. I need to particularize it, have a chance to digest it, and perhaps bring in expert testimony on both sides about kind of legitimate sources of income versus illegitimate ones.
And you mentioned that, they're also linking his company. So maybe that's his, record studio, or maybe that's, his vodka line. But how does something like a vodka line, how can that potentially even be mixed up with this? How can they say that that's linked to an alleged crime?
Yeah, it's really one of two or maybe even three ways. One is if there's somehow a tie-in where that property, that business was used to facilitate the freak-offs that are in the indictment, for instance, or obstructionist behavior. So if they literally used a record studio for a party and the record studio belonged to one of his companies, you could say that actually facilitated or was an instrumentality to support the criminal conduct. The other way is essentially if it is a proceed, if it was essentially built on money that comes from illegal activity. And then thirdly, and this is where it gets really crazy confusing, so I'll keep it short. Sometimes there's something called substitute assets where the government says, okay, we realize that particular asset, that car, that piece of art was not actually bought by proceeds or served to contribute to the crime. But because we can't find enough to satisfy the overall amount we're owed, we're going to take it as a substitute asset. It's a very government-friendly area, this whole idea of federal forfeiture. And again, I think they're in a position where they might have their mitts on almost anything he's ever touched.
And how do they decide just that number that they're looking for? Is there kind of like a flat out number that the government, when charging with these types of cases, that they say, hey, we're looking for 50 million, we're looking for 60 million? How do they decide how much?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, that is an easier task in some circumstances where you have a fraud situation where you can tell the amount of victimization and say, well, look, it adds up to 2.5 million, and they put that in the forfeiture indictment. They don't have that here. In a drug case, for instance, you might say, well, they were responsible for 10 kilograms of cocaine. A kilogram's about 30,000. So we're looking for 3 million, do the math. Here, it's much more wide open. I think you're looking at an actual trial within a trial if we get to the forfeiture phase, where there's going to be experts saying this is money that's untouched by any sort of criminal enterprise from the defense side, and maybe a forensic auditor from the FBI saying, here's why we're entitled to all these types of proceeds or instruments. So it is a wide open battlefield. It's going to be kind of a textbook example of how deep the government tries to reach for forfeiture if they get to that point.
At what point does that kind of strategy from prosecutors become legally risky for them, though?
That's the thing. I mean, the court of public opinion every now and then turns on forfeiture. And, the idea of forfeiture is that you don't want people to not just get away with crime, but profit from it. Being criminally prosecuted and put in prison doesn't mean that you've lost the assets. And so the idea is to kind of make things even, to hold people accountable, to not let them profit from criminal activity. But over time, you see abuses. You see situations where a person barely had a role in some sort of criminal conspiracy. I mean, literally was on the job for one day and is ordered to forfeit millions of dollars. And that bubbles up to the Supreme Court where they say this is just not totally fair. So there are abuses of.
It fights. At first, the belief is simple: this is temporary. A contract delay, a frozen account, a dispute that will resolve itself. That belief buys time. It keeps panic away for a few days, sometimes weeks. But time is cruel when it's not on your side. Each day without deposits makes denial harder to defend. Zero becomes louder. Phones that once rang constantly fall silent. Messages that once got instant replies now sit unread. Meetings get postponed indefinitely. People who once depended on access suddenly don't need it. Influence reveals itself as conditional, and conditions have changed. The collapse isn't loud, it's isolating. When revenue dries up, power evaporates faster than reputation. Control slips first. Control over timing, control over narrative, control over who stays and who leaves. Decisions become reactions. Planning turns into survival. Assets that once symbolized dominance become burdens overnight. Property
of the forfeiture system that are seen from time to time. I think, look, if P. Diddy, if Sean Combs is convicted in this case, I don't think he's going to necessarily gin up a ton of sympathy. But there may be legal observers that say, hey, this is a broad, overreaching moment, when they try to collect every single penny that a guy who obviously had legitimate income over long periods of his life.
And for those that do say, hey, isn't this just a financial overreach? How do prosecutors justify that?
Yeah, I think they justify it by saying, in this case, they'll say, look, two things. Number one, we didn't disable him financially pre-trial. We haven't actually locked into his accounts and taken things and frozen things where it might even affect his ability to hire attorneys or hire experts. And secondly, they say, look, it's a criminal enterprise that extended for a number of years, that where he had financial profit from this kind of power and control over an enterprise. So I don't expect them to be apologetic. I mean, they may end up showing moments of moderation where they say, well, we're not going to go after this company or that company, but they've left it all on the table for now, where they can do a very broad, deeply reaching process if they want to.
And Sean Combs, he's already sold one jet. The Beverly Hills mansion of his is on the market for $61 million or so. Does that seem like someone who is confident that they'll walk, or could that work for or against him in court?
It's probably not going to be anything that's particularly admissible during the trial. It could come up during the forfeiture just to show that his overall stock has dropped. I mean, I think he's down to his last 400 million. It's a real tough spot to be in. But but I think at the end of the day, you really can't draw any firm conclusions. He knows he's got a battle of his life going on right now. I mean, this is a life eligible racketeering case. Doesn't mean he'll necessarily get life. It's not a mandatory sentence. But if the facts continue to be established of years of abusive and controlling behavior, it paints a pretty dark picture for him in terms of sentencing.
And Sean Combs, he's now brought in Mr. Casella, someone who literally wrote the book on asset forfeiture. What's Casella's role likely to be here?
Well, I worked with Steph at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland for years. He is literally the expert on forfeiture. Whenever I have a situation in private practice where I have a question mark about forfeiture, that poor guy has to take my phone call. So he's a great pick. He knows what he's doing. He knows both the process and the law, which can be a little bit different sometimes. I think he's probably, getting them prepared for the types of challenges. And by the way, I don't know this from him, but I would guess that he's basically figuring out what are the types of challenges we could raise in a forfeiture phase. What are the deficiencies in the government's approach? In other words, are they not discounting lawful employment by Sean Combs? And frankly, some of it could even relate to like how he's spending money right now. When you have a broad forfeiture allegation, it's kind of hard to figure out, are they saying that I can't get attorneys of my choosing because I'm using proceeds of criminal activities? So I think he's probably giving a lot of very sage guidance on how they walk through this process of dealing with a very broad, very deep, potentially deep-reaching forfeiture.
Since he is so knowledgeable, and since, I don't know if there's anyone who's more knowledgeable than him in this specific department, do you think that bringing him in may challenge the government's playbook at all?
I think it would certainly give them a moment of pause. Look, the reality is there's probably not a ton of time being spent worrying about forfeiture quite yet. They're probably figuring we'll get there when we get there. We got to try to get a conviction. But yeah, it's
bleed money instead of generating it. Brands lose oxygen without marketing fuel. Partnerships dissolve quietly, not with arguments, but with distance. Silence replaces loyalty. And silence cuts deeper than criticism. Reports begin circulating. Analysts notice gaps. Insiders whisper. Numbers don't lie, but they don't protect either. A zero where millions used to be doesn't just expose financial trouble, it exposes vulnerability. Once vulnerability is visible, pressure multiplies. Every angle tightens. The stress isn't just about money, it's about identity. When a person's value has long been tied to success, loss feels existential. The world stops responding the way it used to. Doors don't open automatically. Respect requires proof again. Rebuilding from zero isn't starting over, it's starting under suspicion. Every pitch feels heavier. Every opportunity comes with hesitation attached. Trust, once cracked, doesn't repair itself quickly. People want guarantees that no longer exist. Confidence without cash sounds hollow.
It's a shot across the bow. You see Steph Casella lining up on the other side, and you can say this about a lot of different type of expert witnesses and things where you say, wow, that's the king of DNA or the queen of forensic fingerprint recovery. So, I think it's a shot across the bow. They'll realize that they've got somebody that really knows their stuff on the other side, but that doesn't necessarily mean they change their approach in any way at this point.
And there's this idea of facilitating property, that a business or maybe an item helped enable a crime. How direct does that link need to be?
Yeah, we should ask Steph. Yeah, that's a great question. You have to be able to show, a significant link. It can't be just like this 6 steps removed kind of thing. Like there was a bottle of liquor that happened to be on the bar during one of these assaults, and he owns a liquor company, so therefore, the liquor we can presume facilitated the crime. You're going to have some, quantum of proof that's deeper than that. But it's very fact specific, and again, that's why I think you're probably looking. Even though a lot of times forfeiture becomes a very small afterthought to a criminal trial, this one really has the potential to be a completely independent kind of mini trial, delving into his finances, delving into issues just like that. Like how well connected can the government make these instrumentalities, these facilitating pieces of property? I think it's, inherently pretty difficult. But again, if you use a location, that's a little bit easier. If you say, I'm going to use my liquor company headquarters, or I'm going to use a record business studio to have one of these freak offs, that becomes a much tougher climb for the defense to get out of it as an instrumentality. It's these kind of third time removed ones where they might have some success.
And like how you said, we're not just talking about past behavior here. Prosecutors say that this was ongoing. Does that make asset recovery just a little bit easier for them?
Yeah, in general, I'd say yes. Because you're talking about a period of years, and you're going to have, during these trials, you're going to have very specific stories from witnesses that say, I was there when X happened at this particular location. But you're probably going to get broad characterizations too. Like he would always, use his liquor to get people drunk before these freak offs, or there were times where we met and discussed how we were going to do this at office X or home Y, or how planes were used. So it might not be a specific moment, but he might have somebody that says, I was at the airport when his private plane brought prostitutes here. So you might not have the precision that you'd have with kind of a single event trial, but you're probably going to have pretty significant stories that, again, tie these properties into the possibility of being forfeited.
How much of a role does public perception play here? Have we seen the DOJ make strategic decisions based on headlines?
Well, overall, sure. We could probably point to all sorts of cases that you could, I think, fairly characterize as a little bit of trophy hunting, where the Department of Justice or even non-federal prosecutors, think this is my great case. And they like the headlines that come with it. But look, I don't think this is an example of a case that's being brought in bad faith. I think it's unusual to see a one-person RICO. It's not legally impossible. You can talk about the enterprise as being broader than the individual. And I think tactically, these are pretty smart prosecutors. I think what we should be watching for over the next few weeks are witnesses that come in as cooperating defendants who have pled to RICO conspiracy. I think that's still to come. And even though it's really not supposed to work this way, a jury takes some comfort from that. Like, there's other people that admit that this was a criminal enterprise. And
behind the scenes, decisions get desperate, assets are sold quietly, teams are reduced, protection shrinks, advisors start speaking carefully. Nobody wants their name attached to a freefall. The illusion finally shatters. This isn't a dip, this isn't a pause, this is a full revenue blackout. A system that once fed itself endlessly now produces nothing, not because of one mistake, but because years of unchecked momentum finally hit reality. Reality doesn't negotiate. The collapse behind the scenes doesn't happen all at once. It peels back layer by layer. First, incoming slows, then it stops, then the outgoing keeps going like nothing changed. That's when the pressure starts, quiet pressure, the kind that keeps people awake but never makes the news. Security still needs paying, properties still bleed maintenance costs, staff still expects checks on time, advisors still bill by the hour. The machine was built to consume constantly, not to survive famine. Zero exposes that instantly.
They were part of it. They're actually usually instructed to not draw that conclusion at the expense of, like Sean Combs in this case. But that's a hard thing. You hear 3 or 4 people go, yeah, I was a part of a criminal group. It makes it a little bit easier on some level for them to convict the target of that particular trial.
Well, 2 questions here as a follow-up. When you say, some people may come on the stand and say, yeah, I was a part of that group. Does that count as like a former assistant or some sorts? Because I know one of his former assistants took the stand and said that he set up, he allegedly set up some drugs for Sean Combs in his hotel rooms, or he provided this or he provided that. Does that count? Or are we looking for more of a smoking gun?
Well, what I'm saying is tactically, it's going to be helpful for them to have people that don't just have the inside stories like that, the one you just gave, but that actually say, I'm here under a plea agreement where I've pled guilty to RICO conspiracy. It just sends kind of this emanation to the jury that this is a fairly charged case because these other people have literally put their lives on the line by pleading guilty to it. So again, most of the witnesses that I'm aware of at this point fall into the category of victims or kind of pure witnesses. But I think you're going to see some people that are, maybe more extensively involved, more knowingly involved in some of the terrible things that happen. And they come in and say, I've eaten this plea myself as a condition of my testimony.
Right. And we still have weeks left to go. So I'm sure the government may be bringing this up later on. But going back to the jury, at the end of the day, if Mr. Combs is convicted, who gets the final say on what's seized? Is it the jury? Is it the judge?
Yeah, it's actually the jury. I mean, I've had trials before where the jury, when I was a prosecutor, where the jury would convict. They come out of the jury room to the jury box, and they're holding on to their pocketbooks and their books and their notepads, thinking it's Friday, we're finally going to get to go home. And the judge says, by the way, there's a second part to this trial. And they learn the hard way that the forfeiture actually falls on them. Now, sometimes the forfeiture is kind of self-contained within the guilt innocence. There's not a whole lot to do but argue how much money should be taken from the defendant. But I think this is a case where they're actually going to probably have testimony and stretch their service out a little bit by having this kind of mini trial. Again, they make the decision. Now, sometimes when things have gone badly and you're the defense and you say, we just got convicted of RICO conspiracy, how much do I want this jury to control my life? You can make a run at having a bench trial on forfeiture. You can also try to settle it, but if you want to contest it, you can say, look, Mr. Prosecutor, Mrs. Prosecutor, let's just have the judge handle forfeiture, and they will always agree to that. And then you have kind of a pared down, more legalistic type approach, which is just a judge helping calculate what the forfeiture amount should be and the sources of that forfeiture.
And realistically here, when we're talking about just the assets that could get seized, could Mr. Combs go bankrupt over this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in some ways that feels like the intention of the government when they have something that's so broadly worded. Now, they didn't put a price tag. They didn't say we're looking for $400 million. But, but the import of this forfeiture allegation shouldn't be understated. I mean, he is looking at dire straits if he's convicted, not just in terms of imprisonment, but because they're going to go hard after all these assets.
Yeah, very ironic coming from a rapper that had a song called All About the Benjamins. But I do have a question. Let's flip it here. What if Mr. Combs is acquitted on the major charges? Can he still lose parts of his estate?
He could, but it would really start to smell like an overreach by the government. And the only reason why I'd say he could is legally, you have a different standard, a different burden of proof. The criminal trial is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that he's violated the rule.
Phones that once rang nonstop become quiet. The silence isn't accidental, it's calculated. People sense instability before it's confirmed. They pull back without explanation. Meetings get delayed, promises get vague, access disappears. Influence evaporates faster than money. The belief that it's temporary keeps panic away for a while. There's always an excuse ready, a frozen deal, a delayed release, a legal issue that will pass. Optimism buys time, but time doesn't generate revenue. It only makes the absence louder. Eventually, Denial becomes expensive. Assets that once symbolized dominance turn into liabilities. Big houses don't shrink their bills when the cash stops. Luxury becomes weight. Each possession becomes another drain. Selling quietly becomes necessary, not for strategy, but for survival. Behind closed doors, the tone changes. Conversations that used to be bold become careful. Advisors choose their words. Everyone starts protecting
Combs' MTV show Making the Band. She has since accused Combs of basically grooming her, firing her for refusing to give in to his alleged sexual advances. We have Albie Shore, singer, songwriter, former record executive, dated Kim Porter before she was in a relationship with Combs. There's Roger Bonds, one of Combs' apparent former bodyguards, who's gone on the record to say that he knew Combs was allegedly physically violent with his then-girlfriend, Cassie. At one point in his interview with the documentary's producers, he said of Combs, "When I first met him, I liked him as a person because I didn't know him." You have Kalina Harper, who is part of Combs' group Diddy Dirty Money, released a statement supporting him after the third member of that group, Dawn Richard, had filed a lawsuit against Combs. And in the documentary, Combs can be heard calling Harper to complain about the lawsuit, asking her to put out a statement. A former friend, business partner of Combs, who appears throughout the documentary, is Kirk Burroughs, the co-founder of Bad Boy Records. The two apparently worked very closely together for years. Burroughs served as the general manager, handling the rapidly growing company's funds. And according to Burroughs, when they started Bad Boy, Burroughs was given a 25% stake in the company, with the other 75% being in Combs' mother's name, Janice Combs' name. And we're going to get more into why Burroughs alleges it was set up that way in just a second. But according to Burroughs, Combs allegedly threatened him in 1996 with a baseball bat, forcing him to sign over his stake. So Burroughs apparently sued in 2003. The lawsuit was thrown out because too much time had passed since the alleged incident. And more recently, Burroughs sued Janice Combs for fraud, Combs himself for sexual harassment. This is according to a report from Cinemaholic. And those appear to be ongoing, by the way. Now, Burroughs claims that he was blacklisted from the entertainment industry, led to periods of homelessness. He's since re-entered the music industry, starting Pop Life Entertainment in 2018. This is also per Cinemaholic. So, Elizabeth, there's a lot here. But what did you make of the Burroughs part, where he was proving, you know, this kind of relationship that he had, and that he was coerced into giving up his stake in what would become a multi-million-dollar company? I mean, I guess the allegation is basically that Diddy ruined his life.
Yeah, that was there are a lot of difficult moments in the documentary. I watched all 4 episodes as mentioned, and that was a tough one. And again, information that we hadn't really seen before in prior documentaries. So, you know, this is someone who had co-founded Bad Boy Entertainment with him. A lot of the things he was saying seemed to kind of run along the theme that I think prosecutors were trying to push in the actual case, was that in the prosecutor's view, this is somebody who will do anything to basically get what he wants. He doesn't really care what effects or damage that causes to other people. And it's in different ways, right? Whether it's in the context of alleged abuse, business disputes, alleged sexual assaults, things that have been alleged in the civil lawsuits against him. And I think with Burroughs, it was really, kind of seemed to strike that theme as well, because he's saying, he had forced me out of the stake of my company. You know, he had to deal with things like homelessness, while in the 2000s and 2010s, Diddy was really prospering, music, business, fashion. And one of the things that he had said, what he alleged in the documentary, and again, this is an allegation from him, was that the name Bad Boy Entertainment, Combs's name was not really involved in that on the corporate side. And one of the things he's saying is the reason for that was to avoid having to pay any liability from, the devastating basketball game that had happened in the early 90s, where he was the subject of wrongful death lawsuits.
Themselves. Loyalty thins when risk rises. No one wants to be the last one standing when the structure collapses. This is where the real damage happens. Not publicly, internally. Identity gets shaken when success has been part of the image for decades. Losing money feels like losing self. Confidence cracks. Decision-making slows. Every move feels heavier because mistakes now carry consequences that can't be absorbed. When revenue hits zero, power doesn't just weaken, it disappears. Negotiations flip. Terms worsen, control shifts to the other side of every table. The leverage that once made demands effortless is gone. Now it's requests, now it's waiting, now it's explaining. And explaining is exhausting. The pressure compounds daily. Legal issues don't pause. Investigations don't slow. Scrutiny increases precisely when resources disappear. Defending yourself becomes harder when the budget vanishes. Every hour costs money that isn't coming in. The system starts eating itself. Staff reductions happen quietly.
It's because of the multiple deaths that had occurred as a result of that basketball game that Diddy was behind organizing. So that was really, surprising to hear.
Yeah, that was a big allegation, because the families of the victims killed in that stampede, it was horrible. We're talking about December 28th, 1991. Combs, fellow rapper Heavy D, they hosted this charity basketball game. The game took place at the gymnasium of the City College of New York. And according to the New York Daily News, before the basketball game started, people who weren't let inside, they broke a window, swarmed toward the entrance of the gym, all went down a staircase. The doors at the bottom of those stairs opened towards the stairs, not towards the gym. So once a crowd got down there, they couldn't get the doors open and people started being crushed. 9 people died, dozens of others were injured. And there were no criminal charges that were ever filed against anyone for the stampede, but multiple families and injured victims, they filed lawsuits. And that's just one part, right? So I actually wanted to get into this too. The docuseries devoted a lot of time to the killings of Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls and Combs' alleged connections to this, to both men, obviously knew both of them. So there have been accusations made in the past that Combs' involvement in the East Coast, West Coast rap feud of the 90s, there was more than just talk, that it could have involved things like hit orders. Now, to be clear, these are allegations. There's no evidence to suggest this. This series, though, it emphasizes that he has never been investigated or charged regarding their assassinations. Nevertheless, several interviewees during this documentary expressed that Combs' actions seem suspicious in hindsight. The documentary plays part of an interview that Dwayne "Keefe D. Davis did with investigators looking into Tupac's murder, which had become a cold case. And on the tapes, Keefe D says that Combs agreed to pay him if he killed Tupac and also rival record label head Suge Knight. Now, Davis allegedly admitted that his nephew Orlando Anderson was the one who shot the men, killing Tupac, injuring Knight. But Davis says Combs never came through with any payment. And by the way, Davis is currently awaiting trial for Tupac's murder in Las Vegas. Combs has always denied any involvement in the assassination. That was a big moment, I would say. Elizabeth, that was a big part of this. I didn't know that was going to be a part of this documentary.
I was really surprised as well. So I believe it's the second episode that dedicates a lot of time to it. And like you said, there have been insinuations in the past. They played video clips of, Sean Combs being asked in prior interviews in the 90s and 2000s, do you know, who killed these men? Did you have any involvement? He's always denied it. To be clear, these are just allegations. But yeah, that was really, really shocking. And one of the sort of a little bit more of the backstory behind his alleged involvement with Tupac was that a lot of the interviewees in the documentary were saying that Biggie, who was signed with Bad Boy and who was really close with Diddy at the time, was starting to form a friendship with Tupac, and they were getting really close. And a lot of the interviewees were saying, in their view, Diddy didn't really appreciate that. So I think a lot of the themes that you see again is coming up as him sort of wanting and needing to be the number one person in people's lives, whether it was personal, business. And it's really interesting because you see a lot of the themes that, again, the prosecution was trying to push forward that we saw in his personal life with Cassandra Ventura, always needing to be number one, not necessarily regarding the damages he's doing to other people in the prosecution's eyes, right? Playing out in the business sense. So the backstory is that he didn't appreciate the friendship that was forming between Biggie and Tupac, and therefore, that's where his alleged involvement came in. And then when, in terms of the non-payment, I think that was also a really shocking moment as well, because that's something we saw happening over and over in the documentary. Multiple people who are saying, I was cheated out of my share in the company. I wasn't paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And allegedly, that's sort of how he treated the artists that were on his label. So again, it's the theme of always wanting to be number one and,
Get cut. Protection thins. Corners get trimmed that were never meant to be touched. Each cut weakens the structure further. The safety net unravels thread by thread. Public silence grows. Not because there's nothing to say, but because saying anything risks exposing too much. Silence becomes strategy, disappearance becomes defense, but absence creates its own narrative, and it's never kind. People notice when someone who once dominated space suddenly retreats. Public appearances thin out, statements become vague, energy changes, even without details. People sense the shift, the absence of noise becomes the story. When someone used to dominating headlines disappears, the silence speaks louder than any denial ever could. What's left is exposure. Exposure of habits built for abundance. Exposure of structures that only worked when money flowed freely. Exposure of relationships held together by access and advantage. When those disappear, so does the support. This is the moment when survival replaces ambition. It doesn't care about past wins, cultural impact, or years of dominance. It doesn't respect influence or fear reputation. Zero treats everyone the same. It strips power down to reality. And reality is unforgiving. When revenue collapses completely, the fall isn't glamorous. It's exhausting, it's humiliating, it's lonely, and it forces a reckoning that no amount of confidence can escape. This is what financial ruin actually looks like. Not explosions, not headlines screaming downfall, but a quiet, relentless unraveling behind the scenes, where the numbers stop moving and everything built on them starts to crumble. No speeches fix it, no image repair reverses it, no past success changes the math. When the money is gone, the structure collapses, and all that remains is the truth, exposed, unavoidable, and written in zeros.